Good afternoon, and welcome to the Dungeons & Dragons commentary track for the pilot episode. With me today are several of the very talented people who created the series, including some of the network executives who also worked on the development of the series.
And I'm Mark Evanier, and I think I wrote this one. We'll know in a moment.
I'm Judy Price. I was Vice President of Children's Programs at CBS.
I'm Bob Richardson. I was the producer and supervising director on the show.
I'm Hank Saryoyan. I was the story editor and voice director of all the episodes and also vice president of Marvel in charge of current network programming.
I'm Ted Field. I was the director of children's programming at CBS at the time.
So talk to me about how the Dungeons & Dragons series came to television.
I was approached by the agent for Marvel at the time, and I optioned the property and put it in development for a TV series that fall.
And I was at Hanna-Barbera at the time working on other things, and when it appeared that this show was going to go to Marvel, somehow or other I ended up, I guess at Judy's suggestion, in meetings with David DePatie and Lee Gunther and became VP to oversee this evolution and development. And then I think it was me that decided that Willie Ames and Donnie Most and Adam Rich would be good voices to use, because I remember asking David if he cared, and he said, no, just make Judy happy. So all three of them were friends of mine, and it was really the first time, I think, that known voices played unknown characters and kind of really worked. I think the kids liked it.
The series had actually been in development prior to this.
Well, there had
CBS
been
show?
a year or so before, Marvel Productions tried to sell a show to NBC, which was called either Myth and Magic or Magic and Monsters or some permutation of those words starting with M's. And Dennis Marks, who unfortunately is not here to be part of this commentary track, he passed away fairly recently. Dennis had developed this show for NBC that was a kind of a one-off of Dungeons & Dragons, inspired by the game, but without actually having the rights to it. And then NBC had not bought that show, and it went into limbo. And then at some point, when someone got the idea to actually option the real Dungeons & Dragons, they adapted what Dennis had done and some of the artwork, and by the time the show got on the air, it was a completely different series. But it started with that NBC development.
Now, for many viewers, they aren't going to understand the chain of progression here. This was actually co-developed with CBS, correct?
That's correct.
Yeah.
It's because at the time, it's a little bit different today, the networks paid for the full production costs and also did not participate in, they didn't have any ownership position, they didn't participate in the licensing. And so we did have a lot of say because we paid for it.
They were fairly dictatorial.
Well, and also there were certain things that the networks had to be responsible to, and that is our affiliates and to our viewers, because there were a lot of very strict rules with regard to program practices. And, so there were, not just the programming executives, but also what they call the censors. They did review every script and give serious notes.
Well, Ted, I know one of the issues behind the series was that there was some controversy over it. Do you and Bob want to address that?
I don't remember any controversy really until probably about 10 to 15 years after it was on the air. I have read some of the stuff on the internet where viewers or opposition groups have imbued these characters and the stories with an agenda that we never thought of. We just wanted good stories.
We're dads. My son was 10 at the time and played Dungeons & Dragons with his friends. And I had heard some of the stories about the evil implications of it all, and we had nothing to do with this development. We tried to do a wholesome show about wholesome kids in a fantasy world, and there's always sort of a golden rule implied in it, and a positive value at the end. And Dungeon Master, as opposed to anything evil, was more like Obi-Wan Kenobi than anything else. I mean, he was just trying to give them clues and riddles, or maybe Yoda.
Yeah, we just wanted nice action and adventure type material in here and have
And
a
some
great
laughs,
time with
like
these
that cow.
nice characters.
There was, I mean, I really do have to go back, though. There was controversy at the time with regard to the program, and it was really born out of the controversy over the game. There were some religious groups that thought the game really promoted the devil and negative things in children. In fact, we did get some heat from that, but the network did stand by the show because it was, on the basis of the show, not the game, that the program practices and the executives at the network evaluated it.
Mark, you wrote the pilot episode here. How involved were you in the development of the actual concept?
Not a lot. Dennis Marks had written a Bible, and he'd rewritten it, and a number of other writers had come in and written it. And it had been my experience, maybe Judy can even speak to this, that when you had a show that wasn't working, what people kept doing was adding more characters to it.
Right.
And when the show was given to me, and they said, "Can you do something with this?" It had about 15 regular characters, and every character had a magical gimmick, and there were certain places they had to go in every episode. And there was a gnome. There was a character in the show called the Gnome Who Talks Like W.C. Fields.
Ah, yes.
Yes, and what I did, and I did this on almost every time I was called in on a pilot script that somebody else had written and I had to start over on, was I threw out half the show. And I just threw out, everyone's concern was the show would be too complicated. And I thought what we needed to do was to err on the side of simplicity. In fact, I later on had a slight argument with one of the other writers who felt the show was too simple. He was upset that he said I dumbed down the show too much in the beginning. And I said, you can always make it more complicated in the second episode if you get to one. We've got to prove here that the show can work as a simple show that's accessible to all ages. And so, and then on top of all that, I had 2 days to write the Bible and pilot for this show. I was doing a pilot for ABC, and literally finished the pilot for ABC one morning, and started on this in the afternoon, because CBS had to set their schedule by a certain point. So this show was written very quickly, and then it was rewritten later on somewhat. But
as we began to know the characters better, things sort of took shape, and the dialogue needed to shift a little, which actually this was a great precedent for us, for Muppet Babies, with this many characters to service in a story. And we managed to get them all in every week and even give the unicorn some intelligence rather than just the bleeding little goat, which, again, is thanks to Frank Welker, who...
Yeah, it's always a challenge to keep numbers of characters like this or groups of characters alive and make them interesting. You can't, you pile on hundreds of characters and you don't have enough time to develop each one properly. And that's what Mark's talking about in terms of simplifying it down so that you have time to get involved with each of these characters.
I think also what was important here is the Dungeons & Dragons is a role-playing game. So we had to make it seem real to the audience. These couldn't just be kids playing a role. They had to be in a tight spot trying to get out of it. And that's what the show became, and that's certainly different than what the game is. They aren't role-playing. They're trying to get out of this area.
Trying to get home, basically, from this strange place that Mr. Toad's Wild Ride took them to.
One of the things that Mark brought to it, I mean, I do want to go back and add to Mark because I think he's being a bit modest. The network did wait for Mark to come on board, even though we knew the time frame was very tight. But what Mark brought wasn't just simplification, but he did bring character. And, no show is any good if you don't have relationships and character. The gimmick of Dungeons & Dragons was really brought to life through the characters, not through the gimmick or the device.
Right.
Yeah, one of the big changes I made in this was, aside from throwing out characters, trying to find relationships between them. And I also, one of the keys to it was changing the character who's now he was called Eric, but when I got it, he was called Percy, and he was a character you'd really just want to slap every time he opened his mouth.
Right.
And actually changing him into a more palatable character was the key to a lot of this. But what happened, kind of, as I recall it, was that I was writing at the time I was doing other things. I was writing a variety show for Dick Clark, and I was story editing Richie Rich for ABC, and I couldn't stay with the show. And then they brought Hank on board, and I remember Hank came over to the Dick Clark offices where I was working, and we had lunch.
Which is where Judy and I both came from in our youth.
Yeah, and we went to lunch, and over lunch I remember saying to Hank, "Now, when you cast the voices on this, I don't care who you get for anything, but just don't bother doing auditions for the Unicorn. Just hire Frank Welker."
Right. And we both felt the same about Frank anyway. I mean, I used him on every show we ever did.
I think so. I think everybody used him on every show they ever did.
Yeah.
Frank was a great talent. I had a special once that I did, and half the cast didn't show up for whatever reason. Their car broke down, whatever. Frank did the whole show practically, every voice, and it was like no one knew this was one guy doing the whole thing. So he's a very talented guy.
Frank's accountant did.
Yeah, exactly.
Let's talk about the voice cast because, as you said earlier, this
Right.
was a show that actually had some name actors and it had some non-name actors.
Right.
And one of them is actually a relative of someone in this room.
Yes, actually, that would be Mr. Field here, whose son, Teddy, we hired because we were looking for that kind of voice that doesn't sound like any other kid you heard and is likable. And he was the least experienced actor in the show, and there was a price you pay for that with the other actors. But it was fine. It made things take a little longer, and finally it became that we would record the whole show and just record Bobby separately at the end. But an important thing that Mark just mentioned was the Eric character in particular. I had been working with Judy at ABC, went to Hanna-Barbera to do Fonz and the Happy Days Gang, which didn't come to life the way we wanted it to. The only actor that really put the kind of energy you need to animate was Donnie. And so when I'm reading this character, and I said, well, but Donnie Most, even in Happy Days, is exactly that guy. Every time he opens his mouth, you just want to go, oh, please, why are you talking again? And yet you like him. So he was kind of pivotal. He was one of the first things. And then Willie Ames and I had been friends, and I thought he would be really good. And Hank, the character, and I can't recall, as I said, whether or not we named him because of me.
No,
I don't believe that happened.
He was named before that.
Yeah, thank you. Thank God.
Yeah.
And Dungeon Master.
No, we named Presto after
So then Willie Ames and Adam Rich, I think, had been on that ABC series together where he was the little brother.
8 is Enough.
8 is Enough, yeah. And so we thought that was kind of natural. And then everybody else just sort of evolved over that, but we had the core group of those 3 boys that made it work. And then Katie Lee was great. And I just think it all started to work. And there was always attention paid because of Judy and Mark and myself and Bob and Ted to make sure that the dialogue wasn't interchangeable on the page. When you look at the words, you should know who's talking. And if you don't, we would go back and fine-tune the dialogue so that each character had a distinctive way of speaking.
Yeah, we worked a lot on those scripts. Hank did. I remember going over to his house. And
I had hair
Judy
when
and
we
I-
started.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
did I. And Judy and I, late into the night on storyboards.
Yeah.
I mean, we were, the network, kind of a pain in the patootie, but it was a lot of fun. And the scripts, I think, were terrific.
Well, it had real intellectual substance.
And we
throughout,
kept
and heart.
working. We kept working on them, even in the recording sessions where we thought they could be plussed up.
Yeah.
which-
And Judy gave us, I think because of this, but Judy gave us pretty much liberty starting there that again continued into Muppet Babies, which was, and it's very helpful when you get in a studio and you try to do what's written, if it isn't working, fix it. Don't just go on.
But see, that's what makes a difference, though, because between Hank and also a person like Mark Evanier, they're not only creative and can write, but they also do voice direction. And so you have somebody who can write on the spot. Most voice directors aren't writers, and you don't want them messing with the material. But with Hank, it was very easy, and Mark too. I've worked with Mark in the same capacity, and they know how to fix it on the spot.
Yeah, when I did the pilot script, I had a strange clause in my contract that they could not rewrite what I'd written because I'd had an ugly experience with someone at the studio on a previous show. And for a while, before Hank came on board, they kept coming to me saying, we want to rewrite this. We want to change this in-house. And I said, no, if there's going to be any rewriting done, I will do it. and I did a few other drafts and things like that. And then finally, when Hank came aboard, which I think was about 3 weeks after the show was bought, I said, okay, I know Hank. In fact, Hank and I shared an office at Hanna-Barbera for
That's true.
a
I
brief
forgot.
time.
Yeah.
And I said, yeah, I trust him. So I waived the that clause in his honor. And
I was honored by that, so I felt, really judicious in what the changes were.
Yeah, sometimes on these shows you kind of have to hand them off to other people. Dennis Marks had to hand it off to me, and then I had to hand it off to Hank and to Bob and everyone else. And then I just sat back. I wrote one other one, and then I just sat back and watched the show and enjoyed it after that.
Now, one of the things that was interesting to me about this with CBS being involved in the development is that I noticed that there is a lot of loyalty in some ways between some studios and some networks. CBS seemed to like Filmation, but they also worked a lot with Marvel Studios and so forth. So do you and Ted want to address that?
You get comfortable with people.
You start to trust them over, if they've delivered on a show, just like, Marvel did with Dungeons and Dragons. That's actually what led to them having another show called Muppet Babies, which was a huge hit. Yes, you get very comfortable with studios. It sort of closes it down perhaps, but at the same time, relationships and trusting the people they hire, just like with Dungeons and Dragons, there was a very tight unit there. And, if you trust the people you're working with, that means you don't have to, be on top of every comma and period and crossing all the T's because you know it's going to be taken care of.
Yeah, and Judy had a wonderful way of using that power because she would call and say, go ahead, change it. It just better be funny.
No. I would.
And then she'd hang up, and I'd go, okay.
Well, in many shows they talk about the network messing with us and the network notes and things like that. But in this case, my understanding is that any problems generally came more from standards and practices, not the network.
Yeah, we kind of worked hand in glove, and there was a bit of a conspiracy with Hank and Mark and Bob and Judy and I and the program practices people because they had to have a defensible position and we had to be able to fight their position if we didn't like it. But after a while, we didn't have that much trouble with this.
I never had trouble with CBS standards and practices. ABC standards and practices was terrible. And I think they just, it is true frequently that the network does ruin shows and the standards and practices does ruin shows, and there are people studios I just wouldn't work for a long time there, or that I found it such a contentious atmosphere that I thought no decent show could be created. And that was not the case at CBS at that point. I worked on a couple of the shows for Judy, and they were wonderful experiences, all of them, which was not the case when I worked for NBC or ABC even for a while.
My experience with Judy was that Judy could be exhaustingly thorough, but not contentious. Just more and more and more notes. And she'd say, I don't know that. I just don't think that. What do you think? And I'm thinking, I think I want to go to sleep. It's 4 o'clock in the morning, Judy. I don't want to talk about this anymore.
We had a lot of fun with this show. We really did.
Yeah.
And I think that obviously contributed to what it became. But that was indicative of, I guess, our work ethic on it. We just enjoyed it.
I think, though, we all liked and respected each other, and we were all toiling for the same purpose, and it came out okay. And when things would be not what we expected, and a lot of times, like the one note that I mentioned we got from Broadcast Standards was something that happened actually in animation. It wasn't in the storyboard. We had Venger walking through the fires of his domain, and there was a small character in front of him that he incidentally kind of brushed out of the way with his foot. And we got a note from Broadcast Standards. The only note on the episode was, please do not have Venger kick the dwarf. So we cut that scene out.
Yeah, by the way, when you when you write a cartoon, at least back in these days, you directed it as well. Because these guys don't move across the screen on their own. They don't ad lib. Everything is directed. So initially we'd get a story idea, then a story premise, then an outline, then the script written, Then after the script is written and approved, it goes to storyboard, which is a long, involved process, and then into production. It takes a long time, and everybody's got to cooperate.
And you're doing 12 shows at once in different phases of it, you know? Bob used to bring me those awful charts showing where things were in progress with little boxes in them, and he'd bring them in. I'd say, get that thing out of here. I don't want to look. I said, you need to know where we are on this schedule. I said, no, I don't want to know. I'm going as fast as I can. We can't do this any faster.
I don't think we ever missed, did we?
On this show, no.
It was close.
Yeah,
because
it was always
because at the
close.
time the networks were buying the shows in the spring for the fall. It's not the way it is today. I mean, most shows are developed, it can take several years to get a show to air, but at that time, that wasn't the case.
We literally, in the evenings when we would finish editing the series, this one and Muppet Babies, we had a guy with a Kawasaki motorcycle sitting outside the post-production house waiting with the thing running. We would hand him the tape. He would race off to CBS. We had warned CBS he was coming, and he would run in the door, kick it in the machine, and hit the network feed within 10 seconds.
Any last words for the fans of Dungeons and Dragons?
Well,
Thank you for being fans. We are too.
Yeah.
We're still fans after all this time.
Absolutely.
we were happy that after 25 years they still enjoy this show.
It's a darn good show.
Well, thank you all for being here and for being involved a part of this.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Fox Kids, Fox Kids, Fox Kids, Fox Kids, Fox Kids.